This video is brought to you by patreon.com/worsttake. Get access to exclusive live streams and Discord servers, on-screen shoutouts, and early access to some videos when you join now. Help make sure that we can continue to make content like this by supporting the Patreon. Links are in the description down below. We talked about this with D'Onta Foreman, and when he signed, how so much of the conversation about D'Onta Foreman signing had nothing to do with D'Onta Foreman himself, right? We were talking a lot about what this means for Nick Chubb, what this means for Jerome Ford, that we kind of lost the plot when it came to D'Onta Foreman, and we forgotten, I include myself in this to actually talk about what D'Onta Foreman brings to the table as a football player. The same thing happened with Jameis Winston, where there was such a, I don't want to call it I'll call it this, a non-controversy, right? It was a controversy of nothing when Jameis Winston signed to be the backup quarterback here, that it became about everything else other than Jameis Winston. It became about Deshaun Watson's shoulder. It became about Deshaun Watson's feelings on Joe Flacco, or Joe Flacco's feelings on Deshaun Watson. It became about Joe Flacco. It became about DTR. It became about everything but Jameis Winston. We didn't really get that opportunity to talk about what Jameis Winston brings to the table, because what I think he brings to the table is something that is fascinating for the Cleveland Browns and fascinating for Cleveland Browns fans. And I think the controversy or non-controversy that people created about this being related to the Joe Flacco thing has never added to that. And I just want to put out here, maybe this is just me beating my chest. I was on Q and Cole. I think I even said it on this channel months before Jameis Winston signed here, months before we knew if Joe Flacco was going to return or not. I was a day one contributor to telling people that the argument about Joe Flacco or Deshaun Watson and basing whether Joe Flacco will be back on Deshaun Watson's feelings was kind of just a wrong framing of what was going on, and that the Browns would likely move on from Joe Flacco simply because they're changing the offense and they're going to want to do something different offensively, which requires a different skill set at backup quarterback. And if you look at what the Browns want to add, Jameis Winston, it made a ton of sense. I said this months before they went on and got Jameis Winston to be the backup quarterback. Lo and behold, Jameis Winston becomes the backup quarterback because everybody wants to make sports talk about everything but the freaking sport. Like, a lot of controversies or non-controversies that happen in sports talk are easily solved once you start like remembering this is a sport, right? Is this about Joe Flacco's feelings? Is this about Deshaun Watson's feelings? Is this about Jameis Winston's feelings? No, it's about football. And on a football perspective, Joe Flacco no longer made sense to be the backup quarterback here. But Jameis Winston did. It's that simple. It's really was that simple. It's not that hard to see as long as you care about the sports in sports talk. Now, that being said, let's talk about Jameis Winston, because not only is Jameis Winston one of, if not the most talented backup quarterbacks. I mean, he's a former number 1 overall pick. We'll get into his history. But Jameis Winston, very talented for a backup quarterback. Remember that, for a backup quarterback. I'm not comparing him to the rest of the starters in the league. I'm comparing him to other backup quarterbacks. Jameis Winston, very talented compared to most other backup quarterbacks. And here's the thing about talking about Jameis Winston. It gets tricky because while we all enjoy the press conference clips that we get from Jameis and the podcast appearances that we get from Jameis and some of the silly antics that Jameis Winston gets himself into, it's easy to not, or to miss, and let me word this very correctly, I don't want to get in trouble or make anybody mad, but sometimes I feel like because of all that other stuff, Jameis Winston as a person is really easy to misinterpret. And what I mean by that is some people enjoy the Jameis Winston clips for the same reasons I enjoy them, because he is brilliant, right? Simple, but brilliant. And I appreciate that about Jameis, and I respect that about Jameis. Some people tend to confuse that brilliance with stupid, right? And they kind of mock Jameis and make fun of him and question his intelligence and all of that stuff. And I find that kind of Jameis fandom to be a bit off-putting, because it really takes away from one of the best things about Jameis Winston, especially as a football player, which is his football intelligence. See, when I talk about Jameis Winston as a fun hang in the locker room, I never get any pushback. When I talk about Jameis Winston as a talented quarterback, I never get any pushback. But hilariously enough, the one area that I get pushback on when I praise Jameis here or Deshaun Watson is in their football intelligence. And let's just hone in on the conversation with Jameis. And that cracks me up, because Jameis Winston was once compared to Peyton Manning as far as how insane his football IQ was coming into the NFL. You go look at articles back then. People talked about Jameis as this football wonder kid. He was somebody who was able to start as a freshman at Florida State, and not just start as a freshman at Florida State. I believe he won a national championship or came very close to winning a national championship his freshman year at Florida State. He was a phenomenon. He was a football savant and still is in a lot of ways. Now, has he been able to apply that football genius in a way to add to his career? Not necessarily, even though his status as one of the best backups in the league is certainly assisted by his football savant status amongst people in the know. But he hasn't been able to turn that into like a Hall of Fame football career, right? Which again, when you aren't the best quarterback in the world, people tend to downplay other skills that you bring to the table. But when it comes to Jameis Winston, he went number 1 overall in his draft, not because he's a great athlete. Y'all done seen Jameis Winston try to run before. It's not pretty. He's not a good athlete. He doesn't have the craziest arm in the world. He has a really good arm. He's really talented, all of that stuff. But it's not crazy. He's not Josh Allen. He's not once in a generation arm talent. Where Jameis Winston was always seen as a once in a generation type guy is in his football IQ. This is, again, a guy who led a national championship caliber college football team at the age of 18. His leadership, his football intelligence, those are the two main things that Jameis Winston will always bring to the table, no matter what team he's at. And that's why Jameis Winston is so highly coveted as a backup quarterback, because, yeah, he could play football well, but most of the time you don't want your backup quarterback to play football well. You want your backup quarterback to be a resource, to almost be like an extra coach when it comes to cultivating team chemistry and being able to assist the quarterback on the sidelines. That's what Jameis brings to the table. When Jameis has his helmet on the sideline, or he's listening to his helmet, he's listening to the call, and he's going through the iPad, that's where he adds a ton of value. Now, again, Jameis did not have the greatest pro career. He was never able to apply his brilliance consistently on the football field. If you want me to tell you why it is that Jameis Winston did not succeed in the NFL. I'm not gonna, that's a whole nother video. But what I can do is give you a spark notes on why he did not work as a starter, but why he works brilliantly as a backup quarterback, right? The reason he didn't work as a starter, one, not a great athlete. He wasn't a great athlete at Florida State. And if you don't look like a great athlete in college, you're even worse in the NFL. So there's that. That was a big transition for him. And I think, honestly, one of the biggest problems in guys like him who do end up becoming coaches, right? Sean McVay is one of those guys. They're almost too smart to be successful on a consistent basis because they can sometimes overwhelm themselves with too much information because they're able to kind of take so much in, and then they make a bad decision, or they take too long to make a choice because they can see so much. You pair that with Jameis's kind of gunslinger mentality, and physically he just couldn't keep up, be consistent, and take care of the football, even though he's had spurts of looking like somebody who can most certainly be a starting quarterback in the NFL, like his last long-term stint in New Orleans, right, with the Saints. He looked like somebody who could start. That's why he's a great backup. Right, Jameis is able to give you those stretches where he could play starting quality football. No, he's not the most consistent, but you don't care if your backup's consistent. You care what your backup can do for you in a 4 to 5 week stretch, right? Because that's hopefully the longest you'll ever need your backup for. Can you deliver 4 to 5 good games? If I start you 16, I know I'm not going to get 16 great games, but can I get 4 or 5 on some luck type stuff? That's what Jameis brings as a player, as a backup. But his biggest value to this football team is his mind, his ability to go over things, right? And the Browns have a lot of great football minds in this coaching staff and just on this team, right? You have Amari Cooper, who is well known as a football savant. You have Deshaun Watson, who is well known as a football savant. You have Jameis Winston, well known as a football savant. All three of those guys are going to be working on stuff during the week, during the games, to try to get stuff to open up. And that's the value. If you thought Josh Dobbs provided a lot of sideline value because of his intelligence, Jameis Winston is that times like 8. Right? Like, because Josh Dobbs was always lauded for his intelligence for things that he did outside of football. Jameis Winston is known for being a genius about football. You get the difference, right? And again, this perception of Jameis that exists kind of outside of NFL locker rooms is one that I find interesting, because if you polled guys in the NFL that's played with Jameis, they would be like, oh, Jameis could be a great head coach or a great offensive coordinator one day. Why? Because he works well with people. People like working with him, and he's very smart at football, right? He has all of the good traits to be a good head coach or offensive coordinator one day. But sometimes people have a little trouble seeing it because Jameis be eating W's and dancing with the torn AC. Like, Jameis does do silly stuff like that. That is also like, Jameis don't be helping to this perception thing sometimes. But it's important that we separate those two things, because Jameis Winston, while he's a bit of a goofball at times, still a football savant. In the same way that Dan Campbell can be a goofball at times, but still really knows what he's talking about when it comes to the football, right? That's the point I want to get across. That is the genius of the Jameis Winston signing. That's the genius of Jameis Winston. And that's the thing that I think is flying under the radar as far as Browns talk right now, is the ability and the insight and the value that Jameis Winston brings to this quarterback room because of his football knowledge. It's very smart. He's very respected. He's very creative. That's all I want to talk about. Y'all let me know what y'all think in the comment section down below. Y'all have a great day. Have an even better night. Peace.